welcome everyone, and especially to this fantastic panel. I must say, 30 years of the IPCC makes me feel old because I was a young reporter on a newspaper in Sydney in Australia in 1987, speaking to a scientist, a climate scientist from the CSIRO, the sort of leading science organization of Australia. And what he told me shocked me, and it changed my life, actually, speaking to a scientist about what climate change could bring to the world. And it meant that I took up a career in communication about climate change. So it's amazing what knowledge can do. So that's what we're here to discuss today. We asked everyone to prepare around the topic of the importance of climate knowledge. How do we use climate knowledge, climate science, to advance the decision making, but also to help people become more resilient to what we can expect from climate change. I'm going to ask Arzhanova to speak first. She's the president of the World Underwater Federation. You're one of the most, you work for one of the most exciting organizations, I would say, seeing the impacts of climate change very much from the front line. So please begin, and each of our panelists will give a few remarks to open, and then we'll go into a discussion. So Anna. Yes, you can.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will introduce our organization. It's called CMAS, English name World Underwater Federation. And this is International Sport Federation, which represents underwater activities in underwater sport, science, and oversees an international system of recreational free diving, scuba diving, and snorkeling. CMAS was founded in 1959, and the founding member and key proponent of CMAS was the French underwater explorer and diving pioneer Jacques Cousteau. And he was our first president. Still now, Cousteau's values aim our activities. Nothing would have been possible without the passion and strong friendship. And the sea is our world. Jacques Cousteau said, we have to protect what we love. Today, CMAS is represented by 130 national federations, with members about 3 million divers. And these divers are our soldiers. Our soldiers in order to protect underwater environment and biodiversity. Also, they are the first witnesses of the changes underwater. Divers are encouraged to create and participate in underwater monitoring projects in order to detect and point out changes of a natural habitat of underwater cultural heritage sites. Thus, divers should participate in cleanup activities to collect pollution materials such as plastic or abandoned fishing nets. Our goal is now to clean up the sea and launch a worldwide campaign to raise awareness and influence education involving the young generation in schools and universities. In order to join forces around this problem, we wanted to create the task force called Blue Helmets of the Sea to symbolize the value of our global efforts, because it's not possible to protect our planet without joint efforts of everybody, of all humans on the planet. The Blue Helmets of the Sea from the project became a movement to involve all the authorities, all associations, universities, schools to protect the sea, to protect the ocean. Because the scientific world is very closed, and the normal people, they don't know a lot of things. As you know, everybody in Italy knows that now it's very cold, it's snowy in Rome, and for people it's difficult to understand that the climate change and the water is warmer, and nobody, just some people in Italy and in the world knows that last year in Grand Barrier Reef, because of just 1 degree warming, in some parts of Grand Barrier Reef was died in 67% north part. And the coral reefs are bleaching, and this has destroyed our ocean and all the nature. This is very important to educate the people, educate young generation to protect the marine environment. The Blue Helmets of the Sea was officially launched in 2016 in Salerno. And we have several initiatives inside this project, inside this movement. The most important, the main task is the education of the people to protect the marine environment, to promote the sea cleaning campaigns and recover underwater hidden treasures. But speaking of the CMAS wants to turn the spotlight also on a social emergency that disrupt Europe and the Mediterranean countries, migrants. To this aim, Blue Helmets of the Sea launched the idea to establish, with the cooperation of local authorities and associations, a training courses for underwater activities for migrants of various nationalities who flee from their countries and from the war. We train, the first course, we trained 40 people, 40 young people, and from different countries to dive. But the most important, to love the sea. And we had some people, some young guys. One of them came from North Africa, and his family died in the sea with the boat. He was the only who survived. And the idea is, from hating the sea to give the love to the sea. He has to be educated and learn how to love the sea and how to protect the sea. European Parliament member Silvia Costa welcomed CMAS delegation in Brussels to underline again how Blue Helmets of the Sea is a unique project in the world, and it's necessary to remember that all the mankind needs to protect and share its cultural, naturalistic and environment heritage. One of the biggest problems is plastic in the ocean. You saw the comics. CMAS, in cooperation with the International School of Comics, set up a campaign to raise awareness in defense of the sea through comics. The CMAS would like to involve UNESCO too, and together with scientists, with universities, the divers and the athletes, all the members forming a common front aimed to retrieving the hidden underwater treasuries and freeing and cleaning our sea. We can no longer tolerate plastic islands in the sea. Those plastic islands are huge agglomeration of garbage floating in the ocean and kills millions of marine and bird species. It's an enormous ecological disaster. How we can defend the ocean? Only to join our efforts. And the main initiatives which we propose to protect our nature, to protect our planet by education and involving all the universities, authorities, schools in this education, in this awareness. This is the code of ethic of diver, code of ethic of the people who live in the sea, near the sea, and who don't know when they throw something, plastic, it kills somebody. Education is the most important in this, and we CMAS Academy trainers, during the lessons, we get people achieve to our members and new members to be more involved in environmental problems. Every diver, now we have a new database, and every diver report about the infraction and problem encountered during the excursion. In order to better understand and to better involve the young generation, we have to use social media, Instagram, to collect the images of such as the beauty of the ocean and how fragile its habitats' life as a result of human activity. The global climate changes, pollution, and overexploitation of resources significantly affect the marine life, and possible effects are foreseen: coral bleaching, stormy weather, rising sea levels, and ocean acidification, and as a result, dying of phytoplankton, lungs of the earth. Only 6 degrees of warming of the water probably will kill our ocean. And as our ocean gives us more than 3/4 of the oxygen, it will kill the planet. Awareness of young generation is a great importance to prevent these changes. When they know these effects, they will create sustainable and innovative ideas to stop these effects and to save our planet.
Thank you, Anna. It's an important message, and I think something that makes it very real when we see the impacts on marine species in particular. Moving now to Jan Fuglestvedt, who is the IPCC Vice Chair for Working Group 1. Jan is going to walk us through some of the science and the process that brings us here today. And particularly, it's nice to have an IPCC scientist to tell us what it's like to be one. And you know, you're right there in the front lines of finding out what's going on in the world. So please give us a sense of the process and what we'll be seeing soon.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's really inspiring to see the great interest for IPCC's work. So thank you for your interest. The first slide shows that we have had a very strong development of climate science since the late 1980s. A strong growth in peer-reviewed literature, growing public awareness, and stronger involvement of various actors. As we've heard, the IPCC was established by WMO and UNEP in 1988, and 2 years later we produced the first assessment report, which formed important input to the Climate Convention. The second assessment report formed very important input to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And then the third assessment report increased the focus on adaptation, that we should not only focus on mitigation and reducing the emissions, but that we have a problem that we need to adapt to. And then the fourth assessment report focused on the 2-degree target, which I will come back to. The fifth assessment report, and then I shouldn't forget that year IPCC also received the Nobel Peace Prize for its work. And then the next assessment report formed the basis or very important input for the Paris Agreement. And now we are here. And as you can see, it's, everything is getting broader, the arrow is getting bigger, and we have a lot of interesting and important challenges ahead of us, and I will tell more about that. But first, let's look back on the main conclusion on attribution. If you go back to the first report from 1990, that report gave a broad overview of climate change science, discussion of uncertainties and evidence of warming. Then the second assessment report said the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. And then a few years later, a bit stronger, there is new and stronger evidence that most of the warming observed over the last 50 years is attributable to human activities. And then, in 2007, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And then, the final, or the fifth assessment report, the most recent, very short and clear statement, human influence on the climate system is clear. So we see a very strong and clear development in one of the main conclusions from IPCC work across or over this time scale. And this is due to progress in multiple lines of evidence and maturation of climate science. We have more and better observations, our process-based understanding has developed, and we have more sophisticated models. Let me also say a few words about the long-term temperature goal. In 1996, EU stated that the global average temperature should not exceed 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This was repeated with reference to IPCC at the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen in 2009, that we should try to keep temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. And then in 2013, a review process, which is called the Structured Expert Dialogue, went through the material available and assessed this temperature goal, and it was realized that it is seen as an upper goal and it's inadequate. An upper limit, a defense line, and less warming would be preferable. And it was also acknowledged that the science of the warming of 1.5 is less robust. And then, as you know, in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, and after that, as a consequence of that process, we are now writing a special report on the global warming of 1.5 degrees. And I will tell you more about that in a few seconds. Paris changed a lot. As you know, Article 2 of the Paris Agreement says the goal is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So it was more ambitious than what has been discussed before in certain areas. But it was also recognized that we need more knowledge, more assessment of the science behind 1.5. So Paris invited IPCC to write a special report on the emission pathways consistent with 1.5 and 2 degrees and what the impacts of 1.5 would be. So we are very busy with that now, which I will show you. And as I said, Paris changed a lot because the Kyoto Protocol was more a top-down agreement with international and national stakeholders. And IPCC provided knowledge for that setting. But the Paris Agreement is a bit more bottom-up and more flexible, and countries provide nationally determined contributions. So we have a much more heterogeneous set of stakeholders, international, national, cities, and sectors. And they ask for knowledge that is much more integrated and much more directed towards solutions and action. And we are asked to provide input to the global stocktake. People ask for high-resolution data on climate change. They use the risk framework. They see mitigation and adaptation together. And this is seen in the context of sustainable development. So we assess synergies and co-benefits with other aspects of environmental changes. So the 1.5 report is really a core example of the work that IPCC is doing in this new context. It's, as I said, it is written in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. And the first chapter is a framing chapter. It discusses some terms used in the Paris Agreement and comes up with scientific interpretations on this. And provides or discusses the methods, uncertainties, the scales, the spatial scales and the time scales and the reference levels. And then chapter 2 is about mitigation pathways. Which emissions are allowable if we want to stay below 2 degrees and achieve 1.5? How much can we emit over the next decades? Taking into account, of course, climate sensitivity, short-lived climate forces, technological, institutional, and socio-economic implications. Chapter 3 is about impacts on natural and human systems and studies the avoided impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And then there's a chapter on strengthening and implementing the global response, how to make things happen outside the models in the real world. So technological choices, enabling conditions, and feasibility is discussed there. And then the final chapter about how this is seen in the context of sustainable development. The linkages between climate and sustainable development, the opportunities, challenges, risks, and trade-offs. And as you can see from the figure, we study what does 1.5 mean, how do we get there, what are the differences. And we also study the synergies and trade-offs between all these aspects and perspectives. So that is really a core example of the new work that IPCC is doing, and we are very busy now with producing this report, which will be finalized in October, as we heard. Another example of a new mode of working is the outline for the main report from the Working Group 1. That is the working group that assesses the physical science basis. We have a framing chapter explaining how the report is organized, and we have 2 chapters about the state of the climate system and the human influence on the climate system. Then we have another block of chapters about the processes shaping the future and the global response. And then we have a final set of chapters which goes from the global picture to the regional picture. And this is a bridge to Working Group 2 on mitigation and adaptation and vulnerability. So we go from the global large-scale picture down to the regional level so people can use that for adaptation studies and how to prepare for climate change. IPCC is now also working in a much more integrated manner across the disciplines and across the working groups. So you can see the red part here. These chapters are very relevant for Working Group 3, which does work on mitigation, how can we reduce the emissions, and the blue part is showing the links to Working Group 2 on impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation. So a much more integrated assessment of the climate change science. So finally, I will just summarize by showing how busy IPCC is now and over the next years. Here you can see all the reports coming. The first one in October, the special report on 1.5. And then the next year, 3 reports, one on emission inventories, one on the oceans and the cryosphere, and one on climate and land. And then the 3 red boxes are the Working Group 1, 2, and 3 contributions to the main report, the physical science basis, the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and the one on mitigation of climate change. And it's all summarized and synthesized in what we call the synthesis report at the end here in April 2022. In addition to all these reports, we are also busy preparing some special meetings, one on cities and climate change, which will take place in Canada in next week or so. Then there will be an expert meeting on climate information for regions, climate impacts with a much finer resolution than the global picture. And then there will be an expert meeting on short-lived climate forcers. I mentioned that the synthesis report will summarize all this. And some tentative aspects for the synthesis reports is to focus on the global stocktake. What is needed to take global stocktake? And what are the interaction among emissions, climate risks, and development pathways? And then the next bullet, economic and social costs and benefits of mitigation and adaptation in the context of development pathways. Then adaptation and mitigation actions in the context of sustainable development. And then finally, finance and means of support. And all this is aligned with the Paris process. As we've heard, there will be this dialogue in December this year. The 1.5 will be an element here. And all this work from AR6 will also provide input to the global stocktake in 2023. So as you see, it's a very busy cycle. We're very active. And I encourage you to follow us, read our reports, produce the science we need, and that will increase the quality and the relevance of our work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jan, and it is very clear you are very busy and have been. The IPCC has been very busy for 30 years. So let me now introduce Ambassador Deos Saran. He is Fiji's ambassador to Belgium, the permanent representative to the European Union, and a special envoy to the UNFCCC, the UN's climate convention. He is also the climate ambassador of Fiji to COP23. You were the climate ambassador to COP23 in Bonn, an historic moment where Fiji was the COP president. Let's hear from you on your thoughts on climate knowledge and ambition, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, and very good morning to all of you, and thank you for the nice and very warm welcome and the invitation to share Fiji's experience over presiding of the COP23 and our thoughts are moving on for the new year as we pass on the presidency to Poland in December. Fiji, as you know, is the first small island state to preside over the negotiation. It really has been an honor to be on the forefront on the negotiations. Why we took this responsibility? Being a small island country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, why did we embark on this major task? I think the underpinning reason for us was and is that we experience the impact of climate change every day of our lives. And we felt, and as a result of that, we have been a very strong advocate of climate change impacts in the region, in the Pacific, for the small island states and also globally. Over the years, my Prime Minister has been a very strong advocate globally at the United Nations, trying to bring the people together to the move on the climate front. And this is why we felt that we should assume the responsibility. So at the COP23, what Fiji brought to the COP23 was agency for action. And I would like to think that we were successful in bringing the agency. After successful presiding of the COP23 in November, Fiji seeks to further support the global community for maximum ambition and momentum towards climate action in the year ahead. We are committed to working with the COP24 presidency to keep the timetable for the Paris Agreement work program on track and successfully conclude its implementation guidelines at COP24. We place utmost importance on the Arzhanova dialogue in COP20 in 2018 to lead to increase ambition of the national determined contributions by countries by 2020. We encourage all nations and governments at all levels, civil societies, the private sector, and the scientific community to share ideas and experiences that the world can learn from. In this regard, we eagerly look forward to the IPCC special report on the global warming on 1.5. This is an important input into the Arzhanova dialogue. We look to Poland to consolidate and expand the achievements of COP23 when it assumes the presidency at COP24 in Katowice in December. Fiji stands to readily assist Poland in every way we can. We are continuing to build on our grand coalition for decisive climate action that the COP23 brought together for the first time governments at every level, the civil societies, the private sector, ordinary men and women to accelerate the process. As we have continuously stressed, only by achieving the most ambitious targets of the Paris Agreement can we avoid catastrophe. This is to limit the rise of the global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above that of the pre-industrial age. There is no time to waste. We must reduce emissions of carbon dioxide to zero as soon as possible and maintain the multilateral consensus in decisive climate action. We must act in unionism as a global community to encourage any waivers to stay on course and together raise the ambition at every level. Fiji is also seeking maximum momentum on the ambition on Oceans Pathway that we successfully introduced at COP23 in November. This is a blueprint to link climate change with the health of the oceans in the UN Climate Negotiations Action Agenda. This is of particular concern to all Pacific nations and the coastals and maritime communities on the world all over. Fiji will apply maximum effort to ensure climate action is made more inclusive, including through full participation of women, indigenous peoples, and local communities. We will also focus on implementation of the historic agreement on agriculture that was achieved at COP23. Fiji intends to work closely in 2018 with our global partners in all forums, including the United Nations, the Commonwealth, the regional bodies, such as the Pacific Island Development Forum, Pacific Islands Forum, and the Malaysian Spearhead Group. Fiji will continue to highlight the benefits of opportunities by transition from dirty economies fueled by fossil fuel to clean economy powered by renewable energies such as hydro, solar, and wind. We want to do everything in our power to encourage investment and innovation in emerging technologies such as battery storage and electric vehicles that can provide the world with its energy and transport needs while achieving net zero carbon emission. Last year, I was in Riga at the Baltic Carbon Summit, and the EU made a very remarkable presentation where it tracked down its growth over the last 40 years and the reduction in carbon emission. It shows that while the EU overall has increased and had gained growth over the last 40 years, the carbon emission actually decreased. So the two can be decoupled. And that really is a very important revelation that businesses and CEOs must take on heed. While one may argue that this may be true for EU being a developed region, and developing countries probably have to more rely on fossil fuel and other dirty energy for its development. Studies have shown that even when you go for a full carbon zero emission economy, the impact on global economy would be adversely affected by 0.6% of GDP. So despite that, you can imagine the impact that will have on the sustainability. Fiji believes it is critically important to address the issue of loss and damage, and this we have highlighted at the COP23. We also believe the agent needs to increase and make more accessible finance available for climate adaptation and resilience building in vulnerable countries through such a mechanism as a Green Climate Fund. The Fijian presidency is committed to always linking global and to the local, connecting the calls for global action in the World Climate Forums with practical action on the grounds that will affect the life of ordinary people. We are working on a range of projects to provide ordinary Fijians on things such as climate resilience infrastructure, renewable energy, and affordable insurance against climate-related events. This includes a focus on projects and that can be replicated to other small island countries and small island, and vulnerable nations throughout the world. Allow me to a little bit to dwell on the subject matter of which is for this forum and the work done by the IPCC. Now, how can climate knowledge help enhance implementation of the climate solutions? Climate knowledge is understood here as much as more than knowledge about climate change. It's about it must be broader and must include knowledge about solutions, about obstacles to the implementation of known solutions and the ways to overcome them. An interdisciplinary approach is needed, including knowledge coming from sociology, psychology, and also political science. This climate knowledge will only be useful if it's shared efficiently between policyholders and stakeholders, and among scientists in different regions among themselves. How can weather predictions and climate modeling help to contribute to societies? Weather prediction and climate modeling studies need to be part of the climate services as approach being promoted by the World Meteorological Organization. Weather prediction must serve as early warning system. This is so important for vulnerable island states where extreme weather events can have a huge devastating effect on the economy and its people. Climate modeling results must help design adaptation strategies and guide the efforts to make communities and infrastructure more climate change proof through better understanding of risk of climate extremes. Now, what is the role of climate in advancing innovation? This role is essentially to guide progress on the right direction and at the right pace, which is very important. Those who dismiss the importance of climate knowledge will soon be losers on the international stage because of innovation will take place elsewhere. Climate knowledge in its broadest sense must be a key input as a Taruna dialogue leading up to COP24, as I had mentioned earlier. I would now like to sort of comment on the education system. How can the education system be supported for the next generation climate innovators? The education system must promote dialogue across disciplines and also audacity to look at issues from new viewpoints. Education institutions in the North can benefit from training and dialogue with the schools and universities in countries where are vulnerable to climate change. The non-formal education and training and cultural activities and awareness of raising campaigns can play an important role too, especially if they are coupled with the real action taking place on the ground in the adaptation and mitigation areas. It is essential that knowledge about opportunities offered by climate action be better known, including the advancement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very comprehensive talk that I think there are many points there that we'll come back to shortly in terms of how we use all this knowledge and is it getting through to the right people. Our final speaker is Jonathan Lynn, Head of Communications and Media Relations for IPCC. Jonathan, your opening thoughts.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. And I'd also like to thank the government of Italy and the University of Bologna for hosting us here today, and also say how encouraging it is to see such a big turnout here. You know, the core audience for the IPCC's products is policymakers, but we know it's extremely important to reach out to other stakeholders and to the general public. And that's really what this panel session is about today, I think. We're looking at how climate knowledge can help us all build resilient, low-carbon futures. Now, the IPCC is working very hard to improve its communications work. And it's not just a case of working with authors such as Jan on improving the readability and accessibility of our reports. It's not just about improving our communications materials. We're looking at communications in a wider sense, how we can reach people through both formal and informal education that the ambassador just mentioned. Now, education strictly speaking, isn't part of the IPCC's core mandate. But if you look at the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Article 6 of that deals with education, and in the Paris Agreement itself, Article 12 is also about education. You heard just now from Jan about the way the current work of the IPCC on the 1.5 degree report, and indeed the other reports we're working on, are all linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Agenda. I mean, all of our work at the moment is in the context of that Sustainable Development Agenda. And remember that Sustainable Development Goal number 4 is education, so we're paying attention to that too. And I'd like to tell you now about some of the initiatives that we're working on in this area. Most of this work within the IPCC is being pushed by Working Group 1, the bit of the IPCC that deals with the physical science basis, but the whole organization is following this. Well, one area we're looking at is working together with museums. It's not a traditional partner for the IPCC, but museums are an incredible platform for reaching an interested public. There are museums all over the world. They're interested in the subject. Certainly all the science museums are, but even some of museums specializing in other sectors. And so that's one thing we're looking at. Next month there's an international symposium in Manchester on climate change museums, and the IPCC will be taking part in that. We'll be speaking there, but also speaking to the other participants to see how we can work with them to ensure that museums have an opportunity to work with our materials or produce exhibits based on our materials to reach their own audiences. We're also doing a whole lot of work on developing educational materials out of IPCC products. So there's an organization which actually has its headquarters in Italy, in Trieste, called the Inter-Academy Partnership. This brings all the academies of science of the world together. And they've been looking at how they can develop scientific materials for teachers based on the work of the IPCC. There's a lot of work going on there. During the 22nd Conference of the Parties, which was held in Morocco a couple of years ago, there was a meeting organized by the French and the Moroccan academies to develop this, and now there's a proposal emerging for an Office of Climate Education, which would help develop educational materials based on IPCC products that are coming out over the next 5 years. Other groups looking at this too, and the IPCC has taken part in workshops at the Earth Educators Rendezvous, which was held in Albuquerque, New Mexico last year, where there were discussions about how the physical science work of the IPCC can be disseminated to students from middle school to undergraduate level. There's a session coming up this year at the European Geosciences Union on climate change and education, and we will be giving our ideas there. And we're also looking at, in the work that we do ourselves, each IPCC report includes frequently asked questions, and these would form a natural educational material. So we're looking at how we can make those more suitable, and for instance, Working Group 1, which is the bit that Jan comes from, they're looking at having an open community consultation to develop these frequently asked questions, both for the 1.5 degrees report and the Working Group 1 contribution to AR6. And then we're working with young scientists, early career scientists, to encourage them to how can they get more involved in the work of the IPCC. We're working with the various networks, such as the Young Earth Systems Scientists, or YES. And we had with them, we had a webinar last year with about 200 participants, which was organized together with the World Climate Research Programme. And last but not least, we're working with our own scientists, so the scientists who volunteer to do the work of producing the IPCC reports, and we're helping develop materials that they can use in their own communicating and educational work. So earlier this year, and the way we do that is we work with people in the scientific community as well. You probably know there's a whole discipline of the science of science communication, drawing on the social sciences or on cognitive psychology, and working with people in this area, we can produce scientific material which then speaks to our scientific community. And for instance, earlier this year we produced a communication handbook for IPCC scientists. That's its name. It was produced with a group called Climate Outreach. It says IPCC scientists in the title, but really it could be of use for scientists anywhere who want to communicate with non-specialist audiences. And it goes into subjects like understanding the values of the audience you're speaking to, so that you're speaking on common ground, dealing with the problem that many scientists face of the uncertainty that is always reflected in their work but isn't always understood by a non-specialist audience. So how do you deal with questions of uncertainty, and so on. And in a similar spirit, if you look at an IPCC report, you'll often find that the figures, the illustrations, the graphical material in there can be rather difficult to understand. And you all know the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But unfortunately, when you look at an IPCC figure, sometimes you need 1,000 words just to explain it. So we're working with experts from the University of East Anglia and the Tyndall Centre to develop guidelines on what makes an effective graphic, and we hope that work will be reflected already in the summary for policymakers of the 1.5 degree report. So those are some things we're doing at the moment, and I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll get some good questions.
Thank you. While you have the mic, though, thank you. Could I ask you just how hard it is to translate, for example, what Jan is doing into messages that reach people in Fiji, for example, the divers who are seeing the impacts for themselves? I mean, can you walk us through a little bit the process? But is it very hard? Do you get along with these guys? What's it like doing what you do?
Yeah, thank you for that very challenging question. Actually, I'd say our philosophy is not to translate. I think if you produce a scientific report and the scientists do a great job on producing a piece of science, and then they hand it over to some communications experts and say, now you go and translate that so people can understand it, you've already lost. The important thing, and what we are now doing in the IPCC, is to think about communication right from the very start. So in each of the working groups that are producing our reports, we've embedded communication specialists who have a scientific background themselves, who can work with the authors and make sure that scientific considerations are considered right from the start. And actually this happened even in the previous cycle, in the 5th assessment report, and this was an initiative by the scientists themselves, who realized that the report is maybe 1,500 pages long and weighs 5 kilos. It's not something that is very accessible to a non-specialist readership. There's a summary for policymakers. In that cycle, they were all about 30 pages long and not always as accessible as they could be. So the scientists themselves developed headline statements which digested those reports into, say, 2 sides of paper. But again, they weren't bolted on at the end. They were something they worked with and thought about as they were preparing the whole report. Now, that said, we produce a report which is intended for a global readership, and of course there are going to be different audiences somewhere, and the things that need to be highlighted for say business people in Western Europe might not be the same thing as need to be highlighted for villagers in small island states like Fiji. So there is a need for somebody to do that. And what happened last time round is that other groups took the IPCC reports and prepared versions, their own versions, based on the IPCC reports. These versions hadn't gone through a formal IPCC review and drafting and approval process, but they were still based on, and they targeted specific audiences. And that's happening again now, we hope, with the 1.5 degrees reports. I understand there's a group that's looking at preparing a version of that aimed at cities, for instance. And we hope to see more of that. But there are so many different audiences that would need to hear about this. It would be difficult for the IPCC, whose permanent structures are quite small, to take this on. We rely on friendly organizations to pick up the burden, and then we can work with them and facilitate that.
I think you're right that you need to get these difficult scientific theories and thoughts into something tweetable. I mean, I know that IPCC doesn't tweet, but you rely on others to. Is that right?
Oh, no, actually, I was sitting there tweeting away.
Oh, you were. Good.
But again, we have to be very conservative in our use of social media, because if the IPCC is speaking, it's really saying something that's in a report that's been prepared by a group of scientists, that's been reviewed repeatedly according to very strict procedures, and has finally gone through a formal approval process of government representatives and scientists. And so we can't then bypass that process and start putting out things on social media. So we're quite constrained in what we do. But again, we can use social media to draw attention to our work and to raise the visibility of the organization. And then we rely on other people to pick it up and amplify that and maybe add their own voice.
If you wouldn't mind passing the mic to Ambassador Saran. Just to, you have one, to hear from you, from the Fiji perspective, from Pacific Islanders who are really in the front lines. Is the science is it accessible? Are people understanding it? And how do you in Fiji and in government really translate this into something to help them prepare for the impacts?
I must say that one of the biggest impact that our presidency has done for the creation of awareness in Fiji is that before our presidency, only maybe half a dozen people in Fiji, whole of Fiji, knew something about climate change, as they've been involved in the process, or for that matter, have been studying on that. But after our presidency, every child, every student, members of the public, business community, policy makers, NGOs, civil societies, they are all aware of the impact of climate change. So that is a huge effect of the presidency that is done to our country. Following that, we have taken some measures in translating some of and put some policies and decisions. We have, for example, a ban on the use of plastics. This has initially it was a concern, but now it's been very rarely accepted, and we sort of feel that why do we do it before? So this has been the impact of our presidency on the climate knowledge. In terms of the accessibility of science, we do have a university in Fiji which has got a curriculum now led and is now been formalized. We're now offering formal qualifications towards the climate science program. So it's now getting momentum. So I think we're on the right track on there.
Thank you. And Jan, thank you for your presentation. Some of the conclusions are pretty scary, let's say. And I think Anna mentioned the impacts on oceans. The potential is frightening. How do you see we're doing in terms of bringing that message, the scary message, but then tempering it with what's potential in terms of the solution? And what is that balance important to make?
Yeah, right now we are between two main reports. So looking back at AR5, I think we managed to get the main message across to the users. That's my impression. And I would also like to add that we communicate on several different levels. We have the chapters in the thick underlying reports, and the chapters even have supplementary material with detailed information for those who are really interested. And the chapters are very good review and assessment material if you want to get up to speed and get an overview over a certain topic. And then we have the technical summary, which is a short and brilliant report in my view, and then we have the summary for policymakers. On top of that, we have the headline statements, which is just a two-pager from AR5. And we also have these frequently asked questions. And as Jonathan explained, we are exploring different ways of, or other channels as Twitter and Facebook and so on. So I really think that we are improving. But of course, the message and the material is sometimes really complex. So it's quite a challenge to simplify and without losing the scientific correctness. So it's a balance that we're working on all the time, and we're trying to improve.
What happens if we don't get the message and act sufficiently, with high enough ambition? What in your mind is at stake here?
Well, we may end up at a high temperature scenario, but my feeling is that people are beginning to understand how serious the situation is, and personally, I'm more optimistic now than a few years back, because now people are beginning to understand the potential impacts and also the solutions, that it is possible to introduce new technology and to reduce the emissions. So I'm more optimistic now.
Good. Anna, are you optimistic? Because your blue helmets of the sea divers are really seeing the impacts. So how do you feel having heard this morning in terms of, are we getting the message out?
I think IPCC has to use ambassadors like the public association, like universities, like celebrities, and simplify, of course, the scientific reports and bring video materials, animation, and examples. Because the problem is that many people don't believe in climate changing, because, for example, I heard, for example, that Donald Trump does believe in global warming, and he has support of half of the population of United States. He is whatever, he's a celebrity, so he brings this message to the planet that this is not exist. This is something what scientists create, and it's not reality. And I think that scientists, as I said, the scientific and scientists very close world for the public. If you look at the public today, they read less and less. They watch the programs of fun. They don't have these knowledges. They don't receive these knowledges. Only the small part of people really aware of this. And I think you have to use more ambassadors as a public people, and more simple messages has to be given to the people that, like very, very simple, maybe slogans or maybe some ideas that the climate changing exist, and these are examples with some video material, some animation, some, of course, using the social nets and the Instagrams and Facebook, because the young generation, they use only this. And if you look at the Asian countries, they live in the social nets. They don't use anything else. If you look in all Southeast Asia. I think you have to be more close to public and to use more ambassadors. In this case, we have the possibility to aware the people and the public more globally, and it's a very good example on Fiji how they do it. Now they buy awareness, the public awareness, through many kind of communication. Now they have these knowledges and the people are aware about this.
Yeah, thank you. There are potentially a few ambassadors in this room, some young ambassadors. So I was thinking we might open the floor to questions, if you have any. Where are we going to do this? We're going to get a mic. So let us know if you have a question by a show of your hands. While you're thinking about that, any thoughts coming to Jan to pick up on from what Anna just raised?
I just want to add to what you said and to what Jonathan said about the efforts towards education. I think it would be great if IPCC could inspire the younger people to choose the disciplines that are relevant for the IPCC and the climate change. That is a really good way of educating the larger people and the masses. So I encourage all of you to read the report again and also educate your children and inspire them when they choose their education.
Okay. Any thoughts, any questions in the room? I know you're shy, and it's a very cold day. Perhaps, Ambassador, you could tell us from the point of view of you mentioned the presidency had a huge impact on people's awareness in Fiji. Would you recommend that all countries take up the presidency at some point so that we can increase that awareness? I mean, I think you're right. This was dramatic in terms of people's knowledge. How did that happen? Was it the media? Was it something more than that?
Of course, for Fiji, we're a very small island country, less than 1 million people. And naturally, when we assumed this role, and it required the full engagement of government at all levels, and also the public to make our presidency a success. So through that engagement process, it really sort of got everybody involved. And when everybody got involved, and we also translated that into the formal and informal education process. In the primary schools, in the secondary schools, there were assignments, there were projects being put on the table, and even the design of the logo was there was a campaign to really something that it was designed by not by graphic artists or some expert from overseas or from Fiji, but from the people, from the public. So that also was a very effective tool to engage the public. The design of the logo for our COP. So it was these small initiatives and also a big push by government to educate and engage and involve with all the Fijians that led to the general creating awareness of climate change within Fiji. And I think it has done immense wonders. And I don't think we would have achieved this level of awareness without presidency. Now, with regards to whether this impact will be the same for bigger countries, I'm not quite sure as to dynamics of how the bigger countries make decisions, but very easily for a small island country, it's a very effective way. But it's a huge responsibility, and I must take the opportunity to acknowledge our suspicion to government of Germany. But if it wasn't for them, there's no way a small island country with less than 1 million people could undertake such a huge task.
Impressive. Okay. Any questions? This time, no? Okay. We must have solved all of their worries. But I'm going to ask everyone to have a final thought in terms of where we are now and where we'd like to be 5, 10, 15 years from now in terms of global knowledge, global understanding, and global action. Maybe we could start with you, Anna.
I believe that we can find the solution and to give these knowledges to the people And of course, it's really a pity there's this fantastic, great job that are making by scientists, that are making by IPCC, not coming to everybody. This has to know, these things, these knowledges, has to know every human being, because this is our life, this is our planet. This killing the planet, and the people, we cannot be afraid to scare a little bit people. They have to know what they are waiting. And the parents has to educate their children, because it's their generation, it's their life. And if they will not save the planet, they will not have the life. The generation will finish very soon. So this is what is very important, and this is the main task, I think, for all university and for society and for scientists, not to be so closed, but to bring more information to the public, because you make a great job, but a lot of people don't know about this. Because you know what is going on in the TV. It's all commercial, and the cultural and scientific programs are not very popular. This is what important, maybe to use the popular programs to give this awareness. To use more people, more public authorities and celebrities.
Thank you for your reflections. I would like to say again that IPCC is a very broad and open process. Personally, I find it a very fascinating and inspiring process, and there are many ways to contribute. First of all, we need scientific papers. That is the basis for the assessment we're doing. So if you write a paper, you may later also be nominated as an author for the report. And we have just selected several hundred authors for the 6th assessment report, and that is a really inspiring role to take. You get an overview, you meet other scientists from all over the world, you take part in writing one of the most important reports in the climate change field. And as I also said, if you're not an author or a scientist, read our reports and spread the message. And as I said, Paris changed setting here, and the IPCC reports are more important than ever in my view, especially with this very ambitious goal of 1.5. We need to know what's going on in the climate system, and we need a very good dialogue between the scientists and the policymakers. And as you said, the general audience, the broader audience, they need to know what's going on. So dialogue is a key word for me. Thank you.
I think on the climate information, it is important that we institutionalize the climate education both in the formal and informal sector. I think it's much more easier in the formal sector. It can be part of the primary school, secondary school, and tertiary education curricula. When it comes down to the informal sector, that's where the challenge is, because a lot of time it's voluntary, it's all the time driven by agendas of various institutions, NGOs, or civil society and policymakers. This is where the underpinning ammunition or the basis would be the studies, the climate, the scientists, the work of the scientists. And in this regard, the IPCC is really the foundation for this. And I think we all sort of know that it is IPCC which gave us the Paris Agreement, really. And I would like to believe that the good work be done by the IPCC, regardless of it's been complicated, and by nature science is complicated. It will need to be the policymakers, the states, will need to sort of eagerly await and respect the outcomes and translate what the messages is into their policies, because apart from the action on the ground, it really has to be from the push and pull factor. The push factor will have to come from governments to put in place the policies and reform the economies. the pull factor would have to come from consumers. The demand, demand solutions or products which are less carbon emitters. So I think it has to go hand in hand in this respect. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, my hope is that we'll get better and better at communicating, which is the material that, as you say, is so important. And luckily, many of the scientists that we have are really superb communicators. But I would say in the end, and I think you touched on this as well, Anna, that when you pointed out what a great job Fiji had done picking up on what the ambassador was saying, I think in the end, this is something that the governments themselves have to handle, because the circumstances for communicating this material vary so much from place to place, and it's our job to make sure that governments have the scientific material that they can then work with to spread that message.
Well, thank you to an excellent panel and the excellent discussion. I think maybe the takeaway is that we need the science. We need to communicate the science, but we're all responsible for getting the messages out from whichever perspective we come from divers to teachers to kids in schools in Fiji and everywhere else. That we're all part of it, as are we at the World Bank, as are many of the agencies present here today. Connect for Climate is doing what it can to get out to a young audience around the world, making massive connections by Facebook, by Twitter, and by all manner of social media. So we're all part of it. What we really need is increased ambition. So I think with the report coming from IPCC, we're going to have the reasons to get behind big action, and soon. So thank you again to this great panel. Please thank them for us all. Oh, it turns out we do have a question. Is that right?
Maybe two.
Okay, very quick.
I'm Fabrizio De Frilli. I work at the National Research Center of Forestry and Wood in Italy. I'm also an honorary at the Monash University in Australia. I'd like to pose two very broad questions, trying to breaking the ice, right? Okay, one of the questions is, how you think, I work in climate change and forest ecology. My main research is in that field. And how you think, how much you think the real knowledge and effects of forests on contributing to balancing greenhouse effects and climate change might really count? And second question, how do you think that big important countries, just China, the US, Southeastern Asia, and so on, really respond to the issues input relative to climate change? Thanks.
Who would like to take those two questions? The balancing act and then the importance of the big emitters. Jonathan, as communications director, I think you might be best placed.
Well, the second question, I mean, it's not really for the IPCC as an organization of governments to comment on what individual governments are doing, but you can see that all governments came together in the Paris Agreement to take action and pledged each on their own to make their own individual nationally determined contributions. So there was a recognition of the need for action and an agreement to take action there. And you can also say, I mean, something, I'm not a scientist myself, so I don't want to say anything out of turn, but if one of the conclusions of the last report that the IPCC did was that there are many co-benefits to taking climate action. right? So regardless of the climate, there may be reasons to act on cleaner air in cities, for instance, on better health that way. So many large countries, large emitters, are recognizing this. We read about problems of air pollution in different countries, and countries are responding to that too. Now, whether they're responding to that for reasons of the health of their own population or for reasons of climate, I don't know. But you can see that action is being taken. I'm not sure that I understood the first question about is it about the role of forestry and whether that was being... Yeah, no, yes. I mean, again, I'm not a scientist myself, so but also this is work in progress. This is one of the sort of questions. I think I'm correct in saying one of the questions that's being looked at in the 1.5 degree report. For instance, one of the things you'd have to look at in general, if you're looking at solutions to climate change, is the trade-off between using forests as a sink for emissions and what that does to food supplies by taking up land. So this is the sort of thing that's it is certainly being looked at. It's something that is both ongoing as in terms of original research, so the work is still being done there. And remember that the IPCC doesn't do original research itself. We assess scientific publications produced by other people. Hence Jan's plea just now to encourage those of you who are active in the sciences to produce and publish scientific material that we can work with. So it's ongoing at the level of original research, and it's also ongoing in the reports that we're preparing, where we assess what literature is available on that subject now. I hope that goes some way to answering.
Can I add something again from the public point of view, what is going on? Because the politicians, they are not scientists, and they have to be also better explain what is going on after the climate change and what will happen after 1.5 degrees changing. For example, what happened in Australia, the Grand Barrier Reef, now it was bleaching, part of it died, and it's impact all economy of Australia. And now politicians in Australia, they know what is going on. If in some countries the politicians will know with the climate changing, I speak about the oceans because I know better what is going on in the ocean. But with climate changing, the food chain will change in the sea, and probably we will not have the food. We will not have fish enough. And for some countries, it's tremendous. It's terrible because the main part of the food is coming from the sea. And all these impacts has to be known very well by politicians. They have to know the practical examples, not to be just a modern movement about the environment protection and the global warming, global climate changing, not just the modern movement and to be the modern politics. They have to know exactly what impact they will have in their country, what they lose in economy after something happened with the climate. This is what I talk about. We need more examples, more video, maybe scaring examples. What will happen with this or this place in the world if the climate and will be warm and warm? And what will happen with the ocean, what will happen with the ground, what will happen in the planet. This is exactly what have to know the politicians, the governmental, because they can impact, they can influence their countries, if they will believe in this and they will be scared of this and they will think about this, again, like it happened in Fiji, because they know exactly what will happen when climate change, and they have to take care about this. All governmentals has to take care about this because of their own problem will happen in their countries. This is exactly what we have to do. This is again the bridge between scientists and between the public. And the governmental politicians, they are public, they are not scientists. Many of them, they don't know about your job and they don't believe in this, as I said.
Thank you. We have one more question, I believe, and I think we only have about 10 minutes or less, so let's keep this one very tight.
Okay. Thank you. Congratulations for your very interesting presentation. And I'm from the University of Bologna. I'm working with fruit trees. Also agriculture, or even fruits, are really suffering from this climate change. Very simply, when it starts to rain, you never quit. And when you decided to quit, it never rained. So our trees are really facing problem. We are trying to transfer this knowledge to the students. Sustainability is one of the key words, more or less, of whatever we are teaching, we are doing. And we are looking not at the turtle or animals that really makes a great impression to the public. Even our tree change the blooming time, even change the harvest time. Some early cultivar ripe late, or the late cultivar eventually tend to ripe a little earlier than expected, and this is creating problems. So probably it's not a scare knowing that in the ocean there are 4 plastic islands, I don't know how to call them, more or less as big as Texas. I read some article about this, but knowing that eventually the wine will not be as good as the people eventually think, because there are too many sugar and no color, so the people do not understand what are drinking. So we have to change all the cultural management techniques that we know how to do it, because if not, the quality is not from one side. We're talking about quantity, because there are big losses, and the climate can create this, but the people that is willing to pay eventually want quality, and this create a lot of additional problems. So I think that agriculture could play also a big role in information, not eventually scaring people, because sometimes you may have, I don't know if I'm true or not, but a different reaction to this type of thing. But informing the people that we are facing new disease.
Thank you. I think we need to quickly get to a response to your very important question. And what you raised there is, I think, which is raised in your communications handbook. Talk about what matters to people. And Ambassador would like to pick that up.
No, thank you for raising that point, because I think it's important to note that for the first time after 6 years of negotiations, agriculture was brought on the negotiation table at COP23. And in this context, submissions are being sought from member states and the other and non-state parties to make submission by 31st of March as to what they would like to bring as part of the negotiations on agriculture. While on agriculture, on food security, I thought I'd share this very a sort of sad message that I sort of learned I found out in Rome 2 weeks back when I was there for the general conference at IFAD, where the president himself mentioned that despite all the efforts that we have taken at the global level to reduce the amount of people going on hunger, last year, or the last 2 years, there have been 30 more million people are on hunger, despite all the efforts. And this is primarily because of food security and conflict. So it is really, we really have to address this issue. And then I think the issue regarding the negotiations and actions on the agriculture, we would like to believe they will go a long way in doing so. Because you are absolutely correct. When the extreme weather patterns that has sort of so much settled in now, and not only extreme, the erratic weather patterns has sort of affected the ability for developing countries for food security and impact on agriculture. So this is a very, very fundamental issue as far as the least developed countries and developing countries are concerned.
And Jan, perhaps you could comment on the sort of impact the gentleman raised. Fruit trees, I mean, we're all seeing this changing, blossoming, and is it the end of the wine industry, for example? I mean, maybe your report will tell us.
I cannot say very much about what the report will tell, but I can just repeat that there is a stronger focus on the regional impact and how the different sectors are affected. And also we have a special report on land and climate, which will be of interest from your perspective. So again, keep an eye on all the products that are coming over the next years. That's all I can say now.
I believe we have some questions from our online community, and I'm afraid, I'm sorry I didn't mention them, but please.
So we have a few questions and many people watching online from all over the world. And one question is really focused on solutions. What can citizens do, and what are the institutions as the World Bank doing to provide alternatives and solutions? So maybe Elisabeth, you can close with a few info on that.
I think we're all very, very keen to move from the scary stuff to what can we do about it. And certainly where I work at the World Bank, this is number one thing on our minds, helping countries to actually put in place the national climate plans that they presented in Paris 2 years ago, a bit over now, and turning them into action. And so we are seeing a huge demand from countries for expert help, for finance, for technical solutions, for renewable energy, for energy efficiency, for better transport systems, for green buildings, for every type of solution you can think of. And a lot of what we just discussed here today is driving that demand, that they have heard the news, they've heard the science, they've seen it for themselves, they're seeing it in the agricultural impacts, they're seeing it in people on the move in their countries, leaving vulnerable areas and moving to cities. The economies are affected, and I was pleased to hear today from Mr. Lee that another report coming is on economic impacts. So I think when you start to think of the ramifications, you quickly move to solutions. So I think we are now in that place, and I think the technology is also moving rapidly as a result of that demand increasing. So I think we can sort of round off this conversation with a reasonably positive message in that the 30 years of work to raise the issue is leading to a huge amount of action. What we have to do is make sure it keeps going. So thank you again to a really great panel and for a fabulous discussion. And let's keep talking because we have a whole day more of interesting panels coming. So thank you again.